Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several changes in the Pokrovsk section of the front line. If the updates from yesterday made me say damn, the updates from today made me say WTF. So we look at Kostyantinivka, and the Russians have apparently captured the rest of the town. We see the Russians from gaining a foothold to reaching the central parts of the town. It took about a month, potentially more, since it was last month they first got a foothold within the town. We take a look at how long it took to capture Novohrodivka. It took way too long, and then suddenly they captured the rest of the town in a single day. That is quite the WTF moment. Normally I would be skeptical, but we have this geolocated footage from one of the westernmost buildings and a Russian flag hoisted above it. We see this section of the video where two Russian soldiers are simply running with the flag from one building near the western outskirts to the next building at the western outskirts of the town. And then they hoist the flag and enter the building for safety. The fact that the Russian soldiers are present and are able to hoist the flag, it just shows clearly that the situation is under their control. Normally, no questions would be raised with such a video footage that was geolocated as well. However, Deep State Map argues that this was just a PR move and the complete town is not under Russian control yet. But then again, Deep State Map also claims that New York is not under Russian control yet, and it's simply an encirclement of Ukrainian soldiers, and they were going to be pushed out anytime soon. These developments in Kostyantinivka direction would significantly hit the supply in the Vuhledar direction, as Russians now with control of Kostyantinivka is able to just launch an operation towards Vuhledar, which would cut off an additional road, as there is this connection here at the north which could be cut off. Then the Russians can start a push from the western flank or simply continue pushing from the eastern flank, as they have a very strong flank to the north, considering the control of Kostyantinivka and generally no positions where the Ukrainians can counterattack from in the northern direction. So they could move along the road towards the coal plant here in the northeast of Vuhledar, gain control over that, and then push into the town itself. Or they can completely bypass it by moving on to Vuhledar or continue along the Kostyantinivka village agglomeration here in the north. And we have not even reached the Pokrovsk section yet. We see here in the Pokrovsk direction the Russians have managed to capture Kalinove and Memrik, as well as advance along the fortified positions of the Ukrainians east of Ukrainsk, where the Russians now have almost complete control over the fortified position from Mykolaiivka to Ukrainsk, with just a small part remaining under Ukrainian control east of the village of Lysyivka. This is all as well located on the high grounds, so we see that the Russians will be moving towards Ukrainsk, Lysyivka, as well as move along the south of Selidove towards the western parts of Ukrainsk along the fortified positions to gain control over that as well. Gaining control over this area right here, which now seems very small compared to when we first started talking about it, would allow the Russians to have a very strong position here in the north. To explain the current situation in stages, the Russians are now in a position to start attacking Selidove itself. In the south, the Russians are moving along the fortified positions along Ukrainsk, both to the western and eastern sides. This will allow the Russians to have a good overview over the railway that is connected from the south of Selidove all the way up north to Pokrovsk and down south to Kursk. They can start moving alongside that to move along the flank of the village agglomeration of the Ukrainians from Karolivka in the north all the way down to Ostrivske in the south. This entire area could be flanked by the Russians. Further in the center, we see that there is this straight line of fortified positions. The Russians would look to gain control over that as well. So we see that the Russians would have two targets following the capture of Ukrainsk and Selidove, which would be the train station here along the railways, further down south to Novohrodivka, the fortified positions, and then down to Ilyinka. This will allow the Russians to have the front line from the north, Mikhailivka, Selidove, Ukrainsk, and all the way down south to the Vovcha River north of Kurakhove, which would completely cut off the village agglomeration to the east. So we see that if the Russians continue pushing, as they have been along the fortified positions, the front line here north of Kurakhove all the way to Selidove could completely collapse this entire area here. That is the current situation in the south. As for the Pokrovsk direction itself, it looks like the Russians have gained control over 90% of Novohrodivka. There are the two heights which are still being contested over. This northern one is connected to the third line of defense, west of Hrodivka, where the Russians are here looking to gain control over this section south of Mykolaiivka to push through the north of Novohrodivka. And at the same time, the second hill just to the west is also a target for the Russians to push northwards. So see that the main objective of the Russians is to push north of Novohrodivka, and the fighting near Krasny Yar, Krychyi Yar, and the northern outskirts of Novohrodivka is to push through the third line of defense of the Ukrainians. After this, we see that the railway line connected to the north of Novohrodivka actually splits into two. There's one part that goes into the eastern parts here by Mirnorod, and the second one goes straight ahead into Pokrovsk and along Mirnorod. We see that the one to the east, the one to Mirnorod, is better covered by the forest lines. We see that it is a wide forest line and it continues all the way up to Mirnorod, while the second one has a wide area and a shallow area. This could open for a weakness for the Russians. However, it is also an opportunity for them to push here towards Tsukuryne Yar and flank it from the rear. There's the fortified position by the Ukrainians north of the town. So likely the Russians would be looking to gain a front line along the edge of it, push up to Mirnorod, flank the Ukrainian positions from one railway to the other, then from the rear push towards Tsukuryne Yar and push along the fortified positions, then continue onwards to the next line of defense, look to flank the yet another one as they push continuously into Mich, which would be the industrial area of the Mirnorod direction. Generally, the Russians will continue their advance along the railways, which will be their main focus, and the battle over the third line of defense is now the one commencing following the Russian capture of Novohrodivka. We can consider Novohrodivka fully captured by the Russians and the fighting not taking place in the northern outskirts of Novohrodivka, but at the third line of defense near Pokrovsk instead. We see the similar case with Krasny Yar, which the Russians have managed to capture half of, except for the part along the third line of defense. Therefore, the Russians have captured pretty much everything ahead of the third line of defense. So we see the situation here in the Pokrovsk section is generally a WTF moment. Moving on to the Kursk section of the front line, we see that the Ukrainians have managed to capture Krasnooktyabrskaya. And they are fighting at Komarovka. The Ukrainians here continue their offensive operations to the south of the same river, which is their current main objective. The Ukrainians are looking to gain full control over the southern bank of the river line, where the objective would be to establish full control over that area, have the river as a strong flank to conduct further operations in the Rilsk direction, bypassing Koronevo completely. However, so far the northern flank of Koronevo has failed, and there has been no entry into the western parts. At the same time, the Ukrainians are only slowly advancing in the south of the same river, and this is likely due to the Russians continuously building bridges, and it seems that they have established a new bridge which has been standing for a bit of time, which shows that they are able to continuously supply. The question is raised as to how much are they going to continue this, and how many are they going to be supplying, and all of these questions. It's very difficult to answer, but based on the advances of the Ukrainians, we'll be able to see if their plan is succeeding or not. So far it has not succeeded, but that again, it takes time for supply to run out. Therefore, even if all bridges are completely blown, it will take some time before the effects are shown. Therefore, there is no conclusion as to whether or not this Ukrainian plan and strategy is succeeding here in the local direction. So we see that the Ukrainians continue their Kursk offensive, which has led to the collapse of the Pokrovsk front. And yes, I call this a collapse because comparing it to other months, it has already tripled the speed of advance, and we see that every day that passes, the Russians capture new towns, new villages, and they even captured the town of Novohrodivka, which is actually considered a city in Ukraine with a pre-war population of 12,000 people. It was captured in about 3 days. The direction of Selidove. Selidove itself is considered a city with 22,000 population. The Russians have yet to enter it, but if they capture that in a week, then that completely changes the situation from what it was just a month ago. And that is generally what is considered a collapse of the front, when the Ukrainians are simply completely unable to defend despite the well-fortified positions they have available. Therefore, a message to all the haters complaining about all of the collapsing videos: turns out I was right after all. That is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.